Top Bed Talk.
We wanted to take an opportunity to sit down with the chairs of the POQI team, Andy Shaw and Mike Grocott, to do a little bit deeper dive into what is POQI, Perioperative Quality Initiative, what is the process, how it all kind of works, and talk specifically about POQI 11, some of the things that went really well, some of the challenges, and what we have to look forward to. So, gentlemen, I thought we'd just take a moment to do a little bit deeper dive into where it came from, how it has gotten to where it is now. So, Andy, I'm going to start with you.
So it's literally started on the back of a napkin in the bar at the Washington Duke Hotel. That's absolutely true. We were sat there thinking about, life, the universe, and everything. And I'd been involved in the group called the Acute Dialysis Quality Initiative, which does a similar thing in the acute kidney injury and CRRT space. We wondered whether or not a similar sort of approach might work for perioperative medicine. And so we floated our initial idea to a slightly larger group and raised a little bit of money and then held the meeting in Durham. And that was the start. That was about 6-7 years ago. That went really well. And then we realized that if the concept is to have traction and to grow and develop, then we would need an entity. So we formed a not-for-profit corporation incorporated in New York. And we've been at it ever since, really. We do about 2 to 3 meetings a year, something like that. It is extremely busy. And we can talk as the conversation unfolds about deliverables and goals, but the fundamental principle, as I said earlier on, is to find areas of controversy or uncertainty in our professional disease space and try to help develop and generate practice advisory statements, comments that will help busy clinicians who don't have the time to distill the evidence or synthesize it in their own time, their own professional lives, but want to practice the best evidence-based medicine that they can.
I think that is one of, such a large benefit of it. It really does distill it down and translates a lot of what's sometimes very difficult to understand for a practicing provider every day. So I think that's important. Mike, comments on that?
I think a really important thing to emphasize is that this is not exactly the same as a pure guideline process.
Yeah.
So if you think of the UK NICE guidelines or some of the professional guidelines in the United States, there's a very strict method and relatively high bar in terms of the criteria required for something to be recommended. In the UK, that would include cost effectiveness as well as effectiveness. Oh, okay. So NICE very much thinks about the financial implications within the NHS. And that's a little bit different. It tends to restrict the number of things that can be recommended because they have to exceed that particular bar, and therefore can leave quite a lot of empty space where there are important clinical questions. And it doesn't take into account what I think all of us know from day-to-day practices, that the evidence may not apply. I mean, I'm someone who works as a professional scientist, but the evidence may not apply to local contexts. There may be particular variables that are not directly related to the trial. And if people, and I'm going to give the example in our institution. So I was one of the PREVENT investigators, and I'm very happy with the PREVENT result, which says please don't give intravenous iron before surgery. By the time we'd got to the end of the study, our very enthusiastic perioperative medicine team had started giving intravenous iron. We had an effective clinic, and we more than halved our transfusion rate with no obvious harm, and we're not going to stop.
Right. And
there's no harm signal in that study, so I don't think we have any particular reason to. But some of this is the filtering of the pure evidence through expert consensus. And I think that's one of the reasons, to Bernard's point earlier, we're actually spreading that net a little bit wider to enthusiasts within the EBPOM conference and perhaps others, is potentially adding value as well.
Yeah. Let's take a minute and talk about the people in the room for the POQI.
Well, these people?
Oh, well, we do have these people. And thank you to everyone who participated. But, whenever we choose, or you guys choose for particular topics, how do you decide who actually gets to be in the room and have influence on the recommendations?
Well, the one thing that everybody in the room has in common is deep knowledge of the content space. And so there's a little bit of overlap from one meeting to the next because some familiarity with the methodology is very helpful. We can't have 20 POQI versions. That sounds like a rude song, doesn't it? We can't have 20 newbies around the room. And so some familiarity with the process helps. But apart from that, we find people from as diverse a professional background as we can, to mean medical or nursing or other para-allied health discipline. From geography,
Yes.
we try very hard to make as equal a gender split as we can. Sometimes we get that right. Sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes we think we've got it right and then people drop out at the last minute, and so that alters the balance. But in general, we aim for 3, sometimes 4 groups of about 6 people in each for about an N of about 18 to 20, with a mixed background from the perspective of professional discipline, from geography, and from gender.
We seek divergent views. I mean, we quite deliberately go to literature and look for particularly commentaries expressing opinion that are clearly divergent from each other. And it is striking how often those individuals find it quite easy to reach consensus. Yeah. So the underlying beliefs are often well aligned. And we have, well, Andy, you may want to talk about it, but we have a well-established approach to achieving and documenting consensus or accepting the lack of consensus.
Yeah, one of the things that we do, we might have someone who's expert in one particular group and have them not in that group. And the reason to do that is to make sure that the groupthink that develops in any small group of collected, like-minded thinkers is balanced when that group brings their initial recommendations back to the large group. And we can talk a bit more, if you like, about how the process actually goes on through the days. And then the pre-work and then the post-work and the publication preparation and so on. But in general, we try and provide content expertise within the group, but also in the larger group to balance the risk of groupthink developing.
That's what I was going to say. So no knockdown dragouts, really. Most people go to consensus pretty easily, it seems like. It's
well,
good.
So yes and no.
Yeah.
Some of the discussion and the debate is extremely passionate. Passionate's a better word, but yes, it is heated. And that's okay. And, I always make the point at the beginning of each meeting that consensus doesn't mean 100% agreement. It means 100% of the voices have been heard. And we make great efforts to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. We don't usually have too many wallflowers or shrinking violets. People are usually pretty happy to let us know, and that's deliberate. It makes for a much better discussion, and you get a better result. And I would suggest that now we actually, for the first time, have some quantitative data. I think what I learned from this morning in this room was that the process appears to be working certainly as well as, actually a little better than I thought. I was quite surprised by how well this morning went. So I'm very pleased about that.
I think it's important that we do kind of walk everyone through kind of what a day looks like, what the process kind of is, so they understand.
Well, as we've touched on, there are 3 phases. There's a significant amount of preparation that goes on before anybody walks into the room. So seeking evidence synthesis that's already there, or occasionally we're not doing full-blown systematic reviews, but doing some kind of quick and dirty evidence synthesis where required. One of the elements of diversity I think we touched on is that we try really hard to have some earlier career researchers with fresh ideas, as well as the old grey hairs that you sometimes see. So significant amount of preparation. The questions are framed. The groups will meet virtually, so by email. Often they'll have a call beforehand to talk through what the questions are, and often to draft some preliminary recommendations. In the room, so in the venue, we start off with a very clear description of what the process is, what the rules of engagement are, how we deal with consensus or not. And then we start with a plenary session. So each group will present their questions and their early recommendations. They'll get feedback from the whole assembled group. They take that on board, and then they go off into a working group, so a breakout group if you like. And then we iterate backwards and forwards over 2 days, typically 4, maybe 5 cycles, until we achieve consensus. And we will vote with that. We don't leave the room without a decision. And we will vote, and it's either 100% consensus, or we document the lack of consensus. And either within the manuscripts or sometimes in a separate commentary or editorial, those individuals who don't agree get an opportunity to expand on their views and why they have concerns.
But it is important to state that that's the time to dissent. We can't have 20 people changing their mind afterwards and saying, well, actually, I think I really want to change my mind. So we acknowledge that some people do, with a little more thought, or a little updated nuance, if you will, want to change their minds. But if you vote for something in the room and we move on, that's set in stone. And that's had to be a principle right from the get-go. And that was a founding principle of ADQI as well.
Yeah. I think it's interesting doing the exercise today, how that may, impact something to think about. It was great though to kind of hear it's adding maybe a new layer into that process, perhaps.
So what we did this morning was fantastic.
Yeah.
I thought we were a little nervous about it. I will tell you,
Yeah.
we had quite a long discussion in the room about should we even do this or should we just present the recommendations? And we both and the other board members felt very strongly that if we do that, it's just going to be here's another self-appointed panel telling the audience what they think. And we didn't want to do that. So we felt this was an opportunity to engage the audience, to get more involved, to genuinely find out if what we think resonates or not. And for the most part, it did. One notable exception, which was the 1 to 2 litres, which I think is very interesting. And we'll talk a lot more about that. But the point is to try and encourage not quite crowdfunding, but crowdsourcing, certainly, for these sorts of recommendations. Otherwise, they become ivory tower messaging, and that's not what we want to do at all. We want to try and move beyond that and get into the community and engage the people who do the work in the process. And I think we made an interesting first step towards that today.
I think we've learned a huge amount, both about the specific recommendations that came out of this POQI, some of which obviously were overwhelmingly endorsed, some of which very much not so. It'd be very informative both for the commentary and for subsequent POQIs when we come back and revisit these areas. And I think we've learned a lot about a potential way of enriching the process of doing this through meetings like EBPOM and others. I think you have a question.
Monty Mythen.
A founding POQI board member who I've just stepped down from the board, delighted to be a founding board member. Could you expand on how you might handle the one area that you just referred to, the positive 1 to 2 litres? Because I'm sitting here reflecting on the fact that was probably the most evidence-based recommendation of everything, that the stronger the opinion uncontaminated by data, the greater the consensus. You then had a recommendation that was probably the most evidence-based, and it produced the highest level of non-agreement. How would you take that forward? How can we explore that further?
So we didn't think it was a good idea to come into the room without a plan. So
we're just about to think about what our plan is now. What's our plan, Mike?
So we actually discussed this yesterday. We've had a group who've spent 2 days and come to consensus, and that is their consensus. So I don't think we can change what the outputs of that group were. But overlaid on that, we now have the endorsement or not of a more extensive, very well-informed group. And I think when we present the manuscript to whichever journal it goes to, we can say, so here's the process, here are the recommendations, and here's a detailed description of the methods for establishing a wider consensus of support or dissent. And we can put some commentary around that. It's methodologically interesting in terms of, because having recommendations that don't have buy-in is problematic, however evidence-based they are. And that may be because of poor wording of the recommendations. It may be because different interpretations of the evidence, but I think we need to encompass all those different possibilities in the discussion around this.
Yeah, I view it as the unexpected result when you do an experiment, when you're in the lab and you get some data and you think, well, what's that about? The job is to try and interpret it and understand it and perhaps study it some more. So we won't change the consensus recommendation because the recommendation is the consensus group's recommendation. But as Mike said, that one will probably get a few more paragraphs of discussion, perhaps, than something with 100% concordance.
But
fair?
Might you go back to that group for that specific question and see if you can get some commentary from the people who disagreed? Because it might be just some nuance in the languaging. It might be just too general, too generic, too ill-defined.
It was a third of the room.
And that's what that's only 33 emails. I'm sure we can manage that, can't we?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We could talk about doing that, following up further to find what the actual reason was for not agreeing. Otherwise, we're just speculating, I guess.
Saul Aronson.
So the corollary to that point, where there was ample evidence to suggest the voice of the room may either been confused by the way the question was posed or simply didn't agree. The other end of that spectrum, if I may, was the discussion we had about the blood pressure recommendation 1 being tethered to 3 or not, or standing by itself. And if I understood correctly, the rationalization for splintering was that there was no data to suggest that it was okay as opposed to the point that Monty made that we all recognize that there was ample data to suggest that it wasn't okay. And so the same question, but taken through another lens and another perspective. How would your POQI 10 resign themselves to that, if you will, question?
I mean, we've got a fairly expert audience in this room. It is interesting, either as a product of the way that the recommendation was worded or of the general belief of those in the room, that there was a very high level of agreement for something where you're right, there certainly isn't randomized controlled trial evidence. And I think that also merits commentary.
Yeah, it was still 2/3 did agree, right? So the percentage at which you agree that the room agrees, obviously this is like the argument over p-values and how many people have to agree before it's consensus and how many not. I think 1/3 of the room is significantly large subset that, as you said, either it was written too vaguely or they just don't agree. And I'm not okay with the first, but I'm totally okay with the second. If they just don't agree, that's okay, that's fine. I think that almost that one result validates the process because it's not just clearly an echo chamber of people who agree and sign on to anything. A significant number of people for that particular question, and the end was high, it was almost 100, I think, in that one, disagreed. And our job now is to figure out why that is.
I think one thing that we did not cover was the recommendation and grading of the different things, because we did not show that.
Very good point. So as part of the POQI process, each of these recommendations comes with a strength of recommendation, which is either strong or weak, and then an assessment of the quality of the evidence supporting that recommendation, which is either high, moderate, low, or very low. And there are specific criteria for doing that. Strong and weak recommendation does not have a value judgment from us about how vehemently we believe that recommendation. But our experience has been, which is now over 11 POQIs and an average N of about 20 people, so let's call it a couple of hundred people, people always get that wrong when they first start thinking about grade. And the usual response is, no, that needs to be a strong recommendation because I really believe it. That's not what the recommendation strength means. So we deliberately left those out today because we did not want people who don't think about grade day in, day out to make that same mistake and potentially disagree with something because they think that a weak recommendation, which a lot of the fluids ones were, should actually have been a strong recommendation. Does that answer that question?
And the quality of evidence metric is not a subjective judgment on whether you think it's a good or bad trial. It's an assessment of whether new information is likely or very likely or unlikely to change the current estimate of effect based on the literature so far.
Fair enough, but I'm trying to look at it through multiple lenses. And there's the lens as a physician scientist that respects data and good data versus maybe not good data and all that sort of stuff and strength of evidence. And then there's the perspective of just drinking Kool-Aid and the inclination to, go with the flow because the Kool-Aid's delicious.
Do you want to explain to about 3/4 of the audience what Kool-Aid is?
I think we have to be careful to protect ourselves from being too excited about our intrinsic bias. And that's what I mean by that. And then I'm looking at it through the lens of perhaps a father or a husband or somebody who's wishing to have their loved one be cared for in a way that may be influenced by these sorts of processes. And there's some things that I want to happen, and there's some things that I would be concerned about may or may not happen because the potential for us to be so sucked into our bias that is translated into these processes. So I'm just sharing with you that I struggle with that because you have influence and there will be behaviors that perhaps will be modified by not recommending a 2-liter positive fluid balance because 1/3 of people in a room decided that they weren't comfortable with the way that was questioned, or somebody giving mega doses of a vasoactive drug because, God forbid, they don't want the blood pressure to be below a certain threshold, even though the patient may be profoundly hypovolemic. And I think we have to be careful about that.
Just one quick comment. I think in general, increasing the sample size has a tendency to reduce bias. And I think that's one of the things we were trying to do this morning. I hope it worked.
Please.
Andrew and Mike, the opportunity to put out to the audience whether there's any questions they regarded that should have been considered inside these is also probably good. I think you may, as the expert panel, may have missed a key question.
I think it's a very useful point. And actually, in response to both those last comments, the reason that we're doing this, the reason we've tried this as an experiment is because of our nervousness that there's the risk of an echo chamber in the room. But I would reflect that actually, certainly the people that I talk to one-to-one in the room, that ultimately the decision-making comes back to exactly what you say, Sol, which is what would I want for my mum, brother, partner, etc.
I have one quick comment. I think this is very important. You have an echo chamber here, but many of these people that I have met and talked to, I think could probably be on the POQI board for the types of conversations here. I'm a private practitioner and I engage because I want to engage. So the question I have for you is, when you do these recommendations, how do you monitor the impact of what your recommendations are? What type of feedback do you get or impact do you get that you're actually making a difference with this? Because quite honestly, I'm sure every place else, we're so busy, I don't have time to read all this literature.
Yeah, it's a good question. We do get emails periodically saying, thank you for doing this, or how could you possibly have forgotten to include whatever. Not as many as I'd like, obviously. One of the things we haven't done a great job of is probably wider dissemination, and we have a few plans on how to do that a little better, especially in the era of the internet and social media. But your point's very well taken. It's important to make sure, if we believe our message is real, and we do, that it actually reaches those who we want it to.
Yeah. Gentlemen, again, thank you so much.
you.
Thank you for all you do for POQI, and we will we'll look forward to hearing more. Thanks, guys. All right.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.